When Mexican film producer Ilya Salkind first conceived of the idea of a Superman movie in 1973, I'm sure he knew he was facing an uphill battle, but one wonders if he ever had any idea of just how chaotic a process he was about to undergo. First, he and his father, Alexander Salkind, and their business partner, Pierre Spengler, had to convince DC Comics to sell them the film rights, which was only accomplished after a long negotiation process. Looking to now make the most out of this following that headache, the trio decided to film both Superman and Superman 2 at the same time. But first, they needed a script, eventually hiring Godfather author Mario Puzo, after both William Goldman and Lee Brackett turned them down. Now, they needed a director. Ilya wanted to hire a young kid named Steven Spielberg, but his father resisted. He was not convinced the Big Fish movie the kid was making was going to hit. Francis Ford Coppola and William Friedkin were considered. Negotiations with Sam Peckinpah broke down when Peckinpah pulled a gun during a meeting with Ilya. George Lucas had to say no due to his obligations to Star Wars. Finally, after being impressed with his work on The Omen, the producers hired Richard Donner. But now there was a problem. Donner hated Puzo's 550-page campy script and wanted to start over from scratch. James Bond screenwriter Tom Mankiewicz was called to Donner's home for a meeting, where he remembers pulling up to the house and seeing Donner run up to him across the lawn in Superman pajamas, complete with red cape. Agreeing with Donner's notion that verisimilitude was the key to making an effective movie, Mankiewicz agreed to heavily rewrite the films, although the final film still credits Puzo as the writer, with Mankiewicz only given a creative consultant credit due to Writers Guild shenanigans. Now, the project needed a Superman. During their initial meetings with DC, the Salkinds and Spengler had thrown out names like Al Pacino, James Caan, Clint Eastwood, Dustin Hoffman, and even Muhammad Ali. Eventually, Robert Redford, Burt Reynolds, Warren Beatty, and Paul Newman were all offered the role, but turned it down. Both Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone were very interested, but apparently neither was ever offered the role. Nick Nolte was, but scared off producers when he asked if he could play the character as schizophrenic. Finally, the casting director convinced Donner to see a young unknown named Christopher Reeve. Despite Donner's concerns, he was too skinny. Reeve's screen test blew away both Donner and the producers, and the big screen finally had its Superman. But they still had to make the movie. Or in this case, movies. By many accounts, production was often incredibly stressful, certainly not helped by the strange behavior of Marlon Brando, who had received a huge sum to play Superman's Kryptonian father Jor-El, but who refused to learn his lines, necessitated cue cards, and at first asked if he could just dub all his lines from home and instead have Jor-El appear on screen as a green suitcase or floating bagel. Meanwhile, there was constant tension between Donner and the Salkinds and Spengler over the escalating budget and shooting schedule. A former Salkinds collaborator, Richard Lester, was brought on set as a co-producer, but was really there to mediate the relationship between Donner and the producers. Donner was suspicious of Lester's presence from the beginning, and as it turns out, he was probably right. Ultimately, even though they had gotten to a point where Donner had shot 75% of the second film, they decided to stop any filming of sequel scenes, concentrate on finishing the first film, and pick filming of the sequel back up after the release of the first movie, taking a gamble since they figured if the first movie bombed, they simply wouldn't finish Part 2. But of course, Superman, released in 1978, was a massive hit, and so once the required players were available, production on Superman 2 was set to resume, minus one key player. On March 15, 1979, Donner was sent a telegram saying his services were no longer required, and Richard Lester would be finishing Superman 2. Lester added a campier, more humorous tone to what Donner had already completed, and, to his credit, recognized his contributions only went so far enough that he did call Donner himself and offer him co-directing credit. But Donner refused, explaining he doesn't share credit. Despite the chaos, Superman 2 was another hit. Richard Lester would solely direct the less successful Superman 3 in 1983, but the box office disappointment of that film and 1984's Supergirl would cause the Salkinds to sell their rights to the Cannon Group, who would put the final nail in the franchise coffin with 1987's Superman: The Quest for Peace. Eventually, as the internet era began, more and more fans learned of the original Donner-Lester-Salkinds controversy, and rumors of a different cut of Superman 2, closer to Donner's vision, began to persist. Eventually, in 2006, Warner Brothers agreed to work with Donner and Mankiewicz to assemble Superman 2: The Donner Cut. Because Donner had not filmed everything he wanted to, this new cut can't be considered an exact approximation of the movie he was attempting to make, but it was as close as he could get at the time, and at least more in line with his original vision. Fans of the series were certainly excited to finally see Donner's version of the sequel, and as it turned out, the year was a real treat for them, because they also got a brand new movie that sought to specifically continue on from what Donner had done, ignoring the Donner-less third and fourth entries. And while it seems production of this film went smoother than those original films had, well, there still would ultimately be controversy regarding its director, though for different, much darker reasons. The year is 2006, and Warner Brothers are looking to restart one of their most iconic but long dormant superhero franchises with Superman Returns.
'Hello, listeners. You've heard of the DCEU. Well, get ready for Failure to Franchise presents the DCPU. Oh my God, open up a window. Jesus. Light a match.
Welcome once again to Failure to Franchise, the show dedicated to some of Hollywood's most infamous mistakes, missteps, and misfires. This is Trev.
And I'm neither a bird nor a plane, just Trev's friend and co-host, Chris.
At least one of those. Co-host, yeah.
Thanks.
So, Chris, the DCPU continues with we've been doing a decade-by-decade look. Now, last time, we looked at Steel, which was like kind of, sort of a Superman movie. Apparently, the people who made the movie didn't get that memo.
Right.
But this time, we're getting a full-on, no doubt about it, Superman extravaganza, 2006's Superman Returns. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this one?
For sure. It is directed by Bryan Singer. He has made some... Yeah. But he has made some pretty, great movies in the past. The Usual Suspects, X-Men, X2, X-Men United. This movie is written by Bryan Singer, Michael Dougherty, and Dan Harris. All three actually were writing partners on X2, and then they did join forces again for the dumpster fire that was X-Men Apocalypse. This movie is based on the character, of course, Superman by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Sidebar, Joe Shuster, Canadian. For any Canadian listeners, you're probably... I hope you remember those Heritage Minutes we used to have, where they kind of they stop for 1 minute during a commercial, and they give you a brief dramatized version of historical Canadians. I sent Trev the link to watch it. I'm probably gonna drop it right here, or at least a clip of it.
And he can lift anything at all. He's that strong.
Joe Shuster, will you stop it or you'll miss your train? Now help me find number 5.
Strong, but by day he's a mild-mannered reporter. Glasses, a secret identity.
Honestly, you Canadian kids.
He'd be in this cape.
A what?
A cape, wearing these blue tights.
A hero in tights, really. Here it is.
Listen, Lois, this guy is faster than anything, I swear.
If you're not fast, you're gonna miss your train.
That's it. A bullet. He's faster. No, he's faster than a speeding bullet.
Come on, get on it. No one's gonna read a comic strip about a strong man in tights, Joe. It'll never fly.
Fly, no. But he can leap over tall buildings. Oh, wow, yeah.
See what your cousin Frank says in Toronto.
Wait, Lois. I've got something for you. Here, take it. It's a gift. You never know. It might be worth something someday. Is he great or what? Bye-bye, Lois.
But Trev, what'd you think of that?
All I could think was it's funny that, like, Canada, almost like your self-shame, where you have to, like, create these little PSAs to be like, look, we have cool people from our country, too. Look, we have important people.
We have one with basketball as well, where they're playing basketball, but there's just a bucket. And then a Canadian, I think, is like, hey, let's cut the bottom out. Anyway, Superman Returns. The budget of this movie is a staggering $263 million. This is where Hollywood accounting takes place. We talk about Hollywood accounting a lot on this podcast, and that most likely includes a lot of developmental costs over the past decade since this movie was in the works. They also spent $100 million on marketing. It was originally budgeted for $184 million, but here we are. It ballooned to $263 for whatever reason, Hollywood accounting. Domestically, the movie made $200 million, and worldwide, it made $391 million. Now, it's crazy that we live in a world, well, not crazy anymore, because, movies now cost an average of $300 million on this level, but typically a $400 million take is a pretty big hit. And unfortunately, what I think happened with this one, we're going to get into the nitty gritty, obviously, of what we think about the film and why we didn't get more sequels, but it had such a big price tag. Yeah. This movie should have made $600 million worldwide, and I'm almost positive we would have had more Brandon Routh adventures. Would you agree with that?
For sure. I think, because the movie was it was sort of a hit, right?
Yeah.
It was just one of those cases where it was too minor of a hit, and I really do think this was a movie, you just alluded to this a second ago, this was a movie sunk by them adding in the overall costs of all the other Superman movies they didn't make.
Yeah.
That was like an albatross around this movie's neck that it couldn't get past, and so it didn't perform huge enough for them to justify, when the bean counters looked at this, the performance wasn't big enough for them to, they weren't looking at it as just, did this movie justify its existence? It was did this movie justify 2 decades plus of us trying to make a new Superman movie?
Right.
And that's unfortunate, because I think, we'll talk what we think about that moving forward, but just on the pure aspect of everybody involved thinking they were going to get to go on to make a next one, by most accounts, just money-wise alone, they probably should have, but that's not what happened. Yeah. So,
and before this one got into production, truly, we got to mention a couple of these Superman movies that were in the making, right? Like there's the famed Superman Lives by Tim Burton that was in the making, starring Nick Cage. More on that in probably a couple episodes from now. Then there was I completely forgot about this, by the way, but Superman Flyby.
Yeah, that was the one that was the closest right before this. The development of that one basically turned into the development of this one.
Yeah, that was supposed to be directed by Mick G. And then it was written by J.J. Abrams, funnily enough, because I guess, a couple years ago he was developing another Superman movie, right? So just interesting that Superman Flyby did not work and became this.
That was the one that controversially, because this was, okay, so you probably remember this too, Chris. This was back in the days where Ain't It Cool News wielded a lot of power. And if they got a hold of your in-development script and wrote a review trashing it, it could actually sync a production.
Right.
And I know with Superman Flyby, that got leaked to somebody, and people reviewed it online, and it was revealed that in J.J. Abrams' script, and this definitely sounds like something Abrams would do, Lex Luthor turned out to be Kryptonian also. Lex Luthor's a CIA agent in this, and then it turned out to be he was actually from Krypton, and everyone's like, what? And so that didn't help its fan response. I do know though, and I didn't see any of this in our material, but I maybe you remember this or hearing this too, that I think there was a period where with Superman Flyby, the leading candidate to play Superman was Brendan Fraser. And I remember always being pretty positive about that casting. I thought that was a good choice at the time, but didn't, as we know, it didn't happen.
And this one that became Superman Returns, Trev kind of talked about it already in the intro here, but it's fundamentally Superman 3. Also a little bit of a, it's kind of, it's Force Awakens before Force Awakens in a lot of ways. It's kind of taking the past and showing you everything you loved, but then also pushing it into the new generation. But Bryan Singer's idea was, hey, and his big pitch to Warner Brothers, especially after Mick G kind of fell out of it, he wanted to kind of make a homage sequel, right? So negating Superman 3, Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, and also our episode on Supergirl. That was kind of negated out of history for this incarnation, and it became one of those re-sequels, Yeah. What are the ones that do re-sequels off the top of your head that they? There's a couple Terminator movies that do that that I'm sure we'll
Halloween
talk
does
about.
it multiple times.
Yes, totally.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre is an entire franchise of re-sequels.
Exorcist is about to do it.
Yep.
Yeah. So there you go.
Neil Blomkamp was developing that Alien one, which thankfully didn't happen.
Oh,
yeah,
right.
Yeah. And so obviously for very clear reasons, this is going to be one of our more difficult movies to talk about in certain aspects, given the man behind the camera and one of the men in front of it.
I would say two of the men in front of it. You're forgetting Frank Langella.
Oh yeah, you're right. We won't shy away from that. We'll talk about our feelings, but as we just talked about, Bryan Singer as just the writer and director of this movie. Chris, do you also remember the big like comic book movie brouhaha about this film? So Bryan Singer, of course, bursts onto the scene with Usual Suspects, becomes a young Hollywood it boy. And then he's like, probably has he's a pupil, not a huge hit, but well respected. It's his choice of projects, and as we said, he makes the X-Men films. Giant hits, very respected. Like right up there with like looked at it with Spider-Man as the movies that like really got comic book movies rolling in this decade, and like finally like more respectable after what the '90s had done to them. But if you remember, he always said during those that like he wasn't a comic book fan growing up. He didn't, and like he was very open when he made X-Men, which I actually thought was respectable at the time. One of the few respectable things you can say about Singer now. He was very like open about the fact that he was not an X-Men fan, and he said he's like, what attracted me to X-Men was more like the parallels about. Once I was introduced to it, the parallels about being grown up and being bullied for what you are and not being accepted. And he's like, I could relate to that. And so he's like, so then I did some homework on X-Men, but really I had friends who knew the X-Men characters help me and like, write it with me. So he's very open about that. And then as he's making X-Men 2, he comes up with the idea for Superman Returns because the one comic book movie he did love growing up was Richard Donner's 1978 Superman, and probably Superman 2 also. He like loved those. He was like, yes, that's what to me is like a comic book movie. Do love those, and he had the idea for part 3. He was lucky that Lauren Schuler Donner happened to be a producer on the X-Men films. So he went to her, told her the pitch. She told Richard Donner. He liked the pitch, and that kind of all got back to Warner Brothers. But the thing was, he was supposed to make X-Men 3. And I'll never forget this at the time because I loved X-Men. I loved X-Men 2, which I thought was just such a leap over X-Men. And I'll never forget when it all hit the trades that Bryan Singer was going to take over Superman Returns. And he asked Fox to just wait for him. He's like, let me make Superman, and then I'll come back and do X-Men 3. And they were like, no, we can't wait for you. We have this giant cast. We have only this like small window. Not only are we getting rid of you, but we're bringing in Brett Ratner. And we all know how that happened. X-Men 3 isn't the kind of movie we would do because it wasn't a franchise, starter, but in spirit, it's the kind of movie we should do on this podcast. Yeah.
And
I just remember being so disheartened that they didn't wait for him to come back and give his version.
Disheartened, and also just they fast-tracked X3 so quickly after too. Like after Bryan Singer left, I mean, he joins Superman in July or June? Yeah, July of 2004, and the release date for X3 is summer 2006. So. I believe at that point the movie wasn't even written. Like there was nothing done with X3. So like Trev said, we're not really going to talk about X3 obviously, but it basically had an 18-month window from penning the script to actually delivering the movie on time, which is we all knew the movie we got. So there you go. Another thing I thought that was interesting with Superman Returns here was it was co-financed. I had completely forgot about that. I realized it when, obviously, the title was going with the movie. But Warner Brothers, who owns everything that DC has, co-financed it with Legendary Pictures. And also, Doherty and Harris wrote 6 drafts of this script. I found that really interesting, too, because... the story was concepted by Bryan Singer, and he's such a big fan of the old movies, not so much maybe comic books in general, but it is pretty incredible that this movie took 6 drafts before they started production. So.
Yeah, you wonder about that, right? Like, I haven't seen anything from the previous drafts, but you have to wonder if, like, was each revision just an attempt to get the fealty to, like, the Donner vibe more accurate? Because that's what I assume might have been the case, Keep, like, it doesn't quite feel like it belongs in the Donnerverse yet, because obviously that's what they're aiming for. We should also point out a very crucial thing about this movie and its release year is that this is coming out 1 year after Batman Begins. Now, Batman Begins, as everyone knows kind of famously now, was not a huge box office hit in the theater, but it was really well respected. A critical darling for a Batman film, and especially coming off of, Batman Forever and then really Batman and Robin, which seemed to kill that franchise forever. And then waiting a while and then coming back with this kind of radical, dark and gritty retelling of the origin that really it seemed like it set DC back on the right path, right? So I think Superman Returns, whatever the next Superman movie is going to be, felt very, very important to them because they had fixed Batman, and Batman Begins by this point was probably already starting to make bank in DVD, which is where it really took off. and they knew they had the Dark Knight in the the wings, so they had to get Superman righted as well. And Chris, just another thing here, because you mentioned this in our last episode, one of our complaints about Steel was that Warner Brothers has always been able to do this shared universe thing. And, it took forever to pull the trigger. And that was another thing I just remember about this movie. Like, following Batman Begins, I'm like, oh, so we did Batman Begins, now we're doing Superman Returns. There's even, like, a little bit of, like, symmetry to those titles, you know?
Yeah.
But I remember just, like, being so frustrated and everything I heard about it that there was never even a second of talk about maybe we'll somehow connect this to Batman Begins. Maybe we'll say Batman Begins is, like, happening in the same universe as the Donner films. But nope, didn't even occur to them, which is weird because the parallels could have been obvious at this point.
Oh, for sure. And even in the movie, they do mention Gotham one time. One time while some like disaster's happening, they're like, oh, 911 or emergencies are coming in from Gotham. And they say it as they list a couple cities out. And it did frustrate me in the Steel discussion because why not? Why not? The reason why it took until 2008 for Iron Man to start the MCU was because Marvel did not own the rights. They famously almost went bankrupt and sold all their IP out to every other studio, including Sony for Spider-Man. And the WB has always owned these characters. So it's like, it's still just shocking to me. Even in the mid-2000s, they were not willing to pull the trigger. And only a couple years later, the MCU does. And then from that point forward, and we'll get into it within in a couple episodes after this one, DC is like running to catch up. So it's fascinating. This was perfect moment. Perfect moment was
we
right
just
now.
had that David Goyer interview where he talked about, like, admitted that, where he said that he's like, even as the writer of his films, he admitted that after Man of Steel, even he said we should have had another Superman solo movie before he rushed into Batman v Superman. But Warner Bros. Was like, no, we need our MCU now. Yeah. But yeah, I might be naive on this. I want to hear your thoughts on it. Like, maybe I'm talking out of my ass, but I do think, because obviously they could have beat the MCU here.
Yeah.
I do think if there had at least been like even an inkling in the press or some kind of sense that this was somehow connected to Batman Begins and you might get to see Christian Bale and Brandon Routh together later, I think that actually would have added to this box office gross quite a bit and like pushed this movie into the level where they would have gone for with the sequel. I think that was like, now obviously that's not entirely on Warner Brothers. I know they were just following what Singer wanted to do and maybe had no interest in that. But if they had pushed that a little bit more, I think that could have actually really helped this movie be a bigger hit than it was.
Oh, absolutely. And especially since, at this point in time, we weren't on social media like we are now. But it was still pretty well known that, George Miller's Justice League was in the making at one point, and then that got kiboshed. There was also a Batman versus Superman movie that was in the makings that got kiboshed. And it's like, there's just so many opportunities for this to have occurred right now. And like you said, it's so simple to have in the press, somebody give, the WB hands the reporter, hey, definitely ask this question to Bryan Singer. Yeah. And then they ask the question, so, Bryan, you think we'll see Christian Bale's Batman anytime soon? And you know what? All he has to say is this, you never know. And that's it. It's like if that hit the trades, I completely agree with you. This would have taken off big time. Absolutely.
Yeah, we should say too. I know we want to talk a little bit about some of the cast members, sure. But before we get to that, I will say like one thing. What was maybe hurting them there? I mean, obviously the fact that they didn't do that and they had no intention to, but like the onus on them and all the pressure of like promoting this movie and talking about it was getting across to people that this was like a new Superman 3. Because we just talked about the idea of like the requel and the legacy sequels, but that was not that wasn't commonly known and accepted in 2006. So I do remember how like hard it seemed like they had to work in like every interview and every bit of promotional material to be like, okay, so just so you know, this is like we are honoring Superman and Superman 2, we're ignoring Superman 3 and Superman 4. We're not necessarily saying they didn't happen, but we're kind of acting like they didn't, And it was just like so like wishy-washy and I think confusing to people. And I think that obviously probably hurt it too. Like, if you were really into comic book movies and like following all this like I was, you got it. You went in knowing what you were getting. But I do think the general audience was maybe like, wait, what? Is that like another one of those? Because obviously it's no longer Christopher Reeve for obvious reasons, but it had to be confusing the marketplace a little bit. But I do remember that just being one of the first cases where they really had to go out of their way in all the promotion of like explaining what timeline this movie even exists in and how it works. And so they couldn't that's kind of a shame. I only bring that up and focus on it because I think it's a shame that
where the focus could have been on, look at this new young star we found, look at this like new version of Superman. Everything instead had to be like, okay, let us explain to you what this movie is and how it follows in like the continuity.
I got to ask you, because now, you know, this is a perfect segue to talk about Brandon Routh a little bit, taking up the mantle from Christopher Reeve. But from your recollection, because I don't really remember, was he like on the promo trail like crazy? Like, were they like, this is our guy, this is the new Superman, and come see him? And Brandon Routh, doesn't he look so much like Christopher Reeve? Like, did they parade him out as much as I remember or think they should have? Do you know?
Not that I remember. I'm sure he did some talk shows and stuff, but at the same time, when you say did they parade him out, was he on the promotional trail? Even as like recently as 2006, that looked a lot different than it does now.
Totally.
There wasn't like, he didn't have hot ones to go on and Wired autocorrect questions and Variety look back at your career. Like now, whenever they're like really pushing someone out, we see all these like YouTube videos of them, and there's tons of talk shows from them beyond and podcasts. And 2006 really was different. So I think, and I also think that might have been, again, you can, in retrospect, you can talk about if this was the right decision or not. I feel like maybe he did some interviews, but I bet you there was some like thinking of like, let's not overexpose him yet. Let's let everyone's like introduction of Brandon Routh be this movie. Let's keep him kind of like a man of mystery until the movie comes out, because he is an unknown. He is this young unknown. Let's have people be introduced to him as Superman, which might have been, a mistake in retrospect, because we'll talk about what we think about him in a little bit. But I mean, he was coming into this with the pressure of not only being the new Superman, but like inheriting this role from Christopher Reeve, one of the most beloved performances of all time. This the ultimate iconic version of the character. I think it would have behooved them to let him get out there a little bit more and talk about like what Christopher Reeve meant to him and the character, because he has said like Brandon Routh was a guy growing up in Iowa that he, as a little kid, wore his Superman pajamas and like ran around the house. Like, this is a character he loved too, and like it would have been probably nice to get him out there talking about that. Would have helped. Plus, he's just a charming, handsome man, so you'd think you'd want to use him as like a secret weapon to promote your movie. But,
totally.
yeah.
Totally. Well, yeah, like he was chosen because he was so unknown. Like I vaguely remember a story that he was like a bartender or something, and then he was kind of discovered there, and then he went to go audition. There was thousands of people that auditioned. He had actually auditioned for Clark Kent in the Smallville show and lost it to Tom Welling. I know Jim Caviezel expressed interest. Speaking of
that.
Yeah, interesting people. He wanted to play Superman, but Bryan Singer was very strict on it. It must be an unknown.
Imagine if this movie was Bryan Singer directing Jim Caviezel as Superman, and then the other actor we're going to talk about in a moment.
Yes. Some other people Singer was looking at before. Whoa, that sounded weird. Not you know what I mean.
No, you're probably right though.
Yeah, exactly. Allegedly. But he got Colossus X2, Daniel Cudmore, to audition. Also, Henry Cavill auditioned for this movie, and same with Chris Pratt. I found that very, very interesting.
Yeah, I believe if you like look deep enough into the internet, you can find like pictures of Cavill's like audition where he's wearing like the more Donner Superman costume. That really reminds me of, this just happens sometimes in Hollywood. If you are a young actor in Hollywood, and you, especially nowadays when things keep getting rebooted and IP is king, if you audition for a role and don't get it, don't be like 100% disheartened, because it might come back around. Because Chris, totally. I think you also are aware that when Timothy Dalton got cast as James Bond, they really wanted Pierce Brosnan at that point.
Right.
But his role on Remington Steele meant he couldn't do it, and then he just had to wait out Timothy Dalton basically, and then he came back around to him. So obviously here the same thing happens with Henry Cavill.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Hey, that might actually happen again with a couple of these actors for Bond, to be honest.
Probably.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, let's just get him out of the way. The other actor, he's a villain in the movie, and allegedly, in some ways, great Kevin Spacey at the time, is in this movie playing Lex Luthor. He got the role because of his friendship with Bryan Singer.
Yeah, obviously they'd worked together in Usual Suspects.
Well, they've worked together.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, they've done a lot together, but they work together notably. And Usual Suspects, an Oscar-winning role for Kevin Spacey, and unlike Brandon Routh, where that like the story of Superman Returns was they auditioned thousands of actors and weeded it down and down until he found Brandon Routh, but he there was no other actor ever in contention for Lex Luthor. Like as soon as like Singer decided he wanted to make this movie, he knew he wanted Spacey as Lex Luthor. And remember, again, you always want to point out what is the connections to the previous movie. So this is not just Kevin Spacey taking over Lex Luthor, but in particular, he's taking over Gene Hackman's version of Lex Luthor.
Yeah.
Which is a little different than like the comic book version and some other media interpretation. So I think he was thinking in his head, like, I know Kevin, I've worked with him. I think Kevin can do a good approximation of what that version of Lex Luthor was like.
Right. Then you gotta get your new Lois Lane. And Spacey actually recommends Kate Bosworth to Singer because they co-starred together in Beyond the Sea. Speaking of another casting that came around later, Amy Adams was up for the role of Lois Lane and ended up getting the role in 2013's Man of Steel. So interesting that happened too. For Perry White, Hugh Laurie was originally cast, but
I had forgotten all about this.
Yeah, and his commitments to House, kind of like the Remington Steele thing you just said about Pierce Brosnan, caused him to drop out. So then they got Frank Langella. So crazy.
Frank Langella. It's funny because I was definitely at the time. This was where I was reading like the internet trades and things like that, and that brought back a memory of it. Because me and at this point, I think this is probably still early enough in the House run where I was maybe still watching it. I definitely dropped out for a bit, but like the first couple of seasons I would watch with my parents. We all liked it. And then I was like, I think I remember even telling my parents, oh, yeah, did you hear Hugh Laurie's going to be in the new Superman movie? But yeah, obviously didn't last long.
No. Then Parker Posey is cast as Kitty Kowalski. We both love Parker Posey.
The world loves Parker Posey.
Yes, the world. The world loves Parker Posey.
If you don't love Parker Posey, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, you're dead inside. Quick sidebar. I'm not going to... Well, I was going to wait to mention this in the review. But in just a year's time... Parker Posey plays a villainous role with a vicious Pomeranian. And speaking about Blade Trinity, where the Pomeranian is a what are they called again from Blade 2? With the mouth comes open, a Reaper. There's like a Reaper strain in the Pomeranian. Did you catch that when you watched the movie?
I mean, you're taking a couple leaps there, but I'm proud of you nonetheless.
I'm only here to entertain you at this point. And then the other actor of note is Jimmy Olsen, played by, what's his name? Sam Huntington. Forgot about that guy. Funnily enough, Shawn Ashmore from X2 was offered the role, but because of his contract with X3, he could not do it. So there you go.
So I'll tell you something, Chris. There's this actor in Hollywood who I feel so bad for because it seems like he's a complete package. Seems like everything about him should make him a star, and he's been trying for years, and it just never seems to happen. And even you just now said that the only other actor of note was Sam Huntington, just completely bypassing this poor guy. Cyclops himself from the X-Men films, James Marsden. Yes,
amazing. Playing for at this point in his life, he's playing professional cuck in every movie he's ever done. The X-Men franchise, Notebook, Enchanted, Best of Me, and this. He's always the other guy, and he always loses the girl. Oh man, that is so funny that I forgot.
He is the one notable X-Men cast member who does come along with Singer this. And sure enough, his role, because of this, is greatly decreased in X3, which some people have speculated, and I 100% believe, was largely retaliation for him coming along and taking such a large role in this movie.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Especially since it's off screen in X3 too.
Yeah.
Unforgivable.
Yes. And then I will just say one other actor, because there's another actor I just want to mention because I just like I don't know if this is the reason they cast her, but I think it's pretty cool. The great classic actress Eva Marie Saint plays Ma Kent in this. And she's obviously, she's known for North by Northwest, but more specifically, she's known for On the Waterfront, which I believe she won an Oscar for. And of course, she co-starred in that with Marlon Brando. That's one of the classic Marlon Brando roles.
Oh, cool.
And so I thought it was really neat that she plays Ma Kent in this, because then there's some really nice symmetry with the fact that Marlon Brando, of course, played Jor-El in the Richard Donner Superman movies. And one of the other so if there's two marketing things about this movie, it was that, okay, first of all, we're going to explain to you how this is actually a sequel to Superman 1 and 2. And then it was not only that, to prove it, we've got Marlon Brando in this movie, the late Marlon Brando reprising his role as Jor-El.
and they did that through some outtakes they had from the previous movie's footage, some digital trickery, but they actually went. This is one of the first occasions of this where they got permission from Marlon Brando's estate to have him, like, in this as a performer. Did some digital trickery, like I said, and outtakes, and he reprises his role as like hologram Jor-El. Yeah. So, but I do think it's kind of cool that you get the two stars on the waterfront, one to play his Kryptonian father and the other to play his human mother.
Totally. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Before we jump into the movie proper, we're talking about how they paraded the marketing out, right? And I do remember Superman Returns kind of being everywhere. Like, I know, obviously, like you said, the Warner Brothers was, they had a lot riding on this, especially after Batman Begins. But man, tie-in deals: General Mills, Burger King, Cheetos, Duracell, Pepsi, Doritos, Papa John's. Another problematic guy. 7-Eleven, Colgate. And then this was so strange to me in the research. Why did they put so many eggs in the race car business? What was that about? Was it just because they were fast?
There was definitely a period where like a lot of movies had like NASCARs. I remember, like that was that was just a weird marketing trend thing there. But
strange, because again, I read that Singer was kind of dissatisfied by the marketing and promotion, but also that might just be because they took an L on the movie, so who knows? Yeah. But found that strange.
Before like as we get off marketing, before we get into like our review, I do say we should also one last thing we should talk about, Chris, because I'm just kind of curious, and I know we probably hit on this a little bit with Supergirl and Steel, but in a larger sense, because it'll probably very much color like our thoughts in the movie. Thoughts on Superman the character, right? And like relationship to the Donner films, obviously, but also just the character in general. So I'm going to let you go first. I just kind of want to hear, at the time, I don't even know if you saw this in the theater, but just like, as a kid growing up, I'm sure you were into like comic book stuff and superheroes as a kid, but what about Superman? Like, what's your take on that character then and even now?
I would say my take on the character now has evolved. I like Superman, the character, a lot more now. I wasn't a huge fan. For the critique that I think you're gonna hate, and a lot of Superman fans hate, is like the whole "you're too powerful," that sort of thing. Yeah. And we'll get into that with this movie as well, because I have something to say there especially. But it's grown. I wasn't a huge fan. I watched the old movies leading up to this one. I believe. No, actually, or did I watch them after? I can't remember, because 2006 was a lifetime ago, it feels like. But I did see Superman Returns twice in theaters. Once with a friend, once with a girlfriend. And this viewing would be my fourth viewing, just so you know. There was one in between, which I will have notes on when we get into it. But Superman the character, wasn't a huge fan. I like him a lot more, especially since the travesty and overcorrection that was Man of Steel. That's what I would say, is that Man of Steel really put into focus how you can completely fuck this character up.
Oh man, so we got the Snyder Bros coming for us now.
Yeah, that's how I felt about that. And I never watched Smallville. I have one of my best friends fucking loves Smallville, so yeah, I didn't watch vicariously through him, but I kind of knew what was going on. And that show lasted a long time too, so I know there's tons of fans. And Tom Welling was like a huge impact, especially when I was growing up. He was like the heartthrob, So when I was in high school and junior high, so not for me, not that there's anything wrong with that, but he was a heartthrob nonetheless. So that's kind of my relation to Superman in general. I know you are, up and away as a big fan, yeah.
Yeah, I love Superman. But just like you, like as your relationship has evolved, I think mine has too. Only in that I think I've become more and more of a fan of Superman as I've gotten older, and I do think that's actually kind of crucial with that character. Well, I mean, I kind of look at it two ways. Like first, so he's like obviously super iconic. He is the superhero, and I think it's very easy when you're a small kid to be into Superman. I do think if you're like a lifelong comic book or superhero fan, probably everyone goes through that phase where suddenly you have that like rebellious like Superman. He's not Batman. He's not Wolverine. You know, he's like the goody two shoes. And I don't remember that period for me, but I know I definitely went through ebbs and flows where I wasn't as into the character. But I never had a time where I was like so like anti-Superman. Because even as a kid, I would collect Superman comics here and there. I certainly bought, that was in rotation for me too. I watched the movies a lot as a kid. I think I talked about this in the Supergirl episode. Like I loved Superman 2 when I was a kid. They were on TV all the time, and I even liked Superman 3. I liked Supergirl, for Christ's sakes. Like that tells you something. And yeah, I remember watching there was a really bad Superboy syndicated TV show when I was younger, and then later in life was into Smallville.
Bryan Singer was a huge fan of that one.
Yeah. But yeah, as I've gotten older and my tastes have changed, and I've started to feel differently about what I look for in superheroes and comic books and storytelling. Superman has just become more and more of my favorite. I think,
cool.
There's always that debate about who's better, Batman or Superman. And my answer to that is always that I think there's a lot better Batman stories because you can tell a more compelling story with Batman. But I do think, to me, the Superman is the better character. Maybe I know that's hard to explain, but I think it's because I like how aspirational he is and what he represents, and that positivity, what he stands for. I think is it actually does move me. I think the character of Superman is what we wish we really had in the real world. I like Batman as a character, but you don't want some crazy vigilante running around beating up poor people. If we had a Superman, we'd be much better off.
Yes. Batman is a crazy person.
Yes.
Superman is so altruistic, and he's heroism incarnate. So I totally get what you're saying for sure. And also, I think Batman gets overshadowed by his rogues gallery. I think more people are familiar with Batman's rogues gallery, and they're fun and kooky characters and stuff too. So maybe that's another reason too. I think people like. I'm not speaking for all people, but I mean, Batman is very successful and fun to watch because you just have so many cool villains. While I think Superman is so super that he maybe overtakes his own rogues gallery. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I'm right there with you. I understand what you mean.
But I do think what's interesting about Superman, and what will obviously play into our discussion about this movie, and why they had so much writing on this and why they maybe thought it was going to be a bigger hit, is Superman is one of those rare characters in just pop culture and society and culture in general, where whether you like the character or not only do you know Superman, but kind of everyone knows his origin. They know his supporting cast. They know his world. It's just this is a character that we've all grown up with, and it's just so ingrained into us. So that's obviously you said the common critiques. He's too powerful. He's too goody two shoes. I will address both those critiques in the review because I think they tie into this movie. But yeah, I just think this is a character that we all know, and I think a lot of us love. So does that necessarily mean a movie's going to come out and be a $1 billion grosser? Obviously not.
Yeah. Let's talk about it.
Yep.
You've been gone a long time. Where did you go?
You have great power. Even though you've been raised as a human being, you are not one of them.
It's not easy for me to live my life being who I am, keeping secrets.
Clark, hey, welcome back. I see you've already met the Munchkin.
Hello. Yeah, well, you've been gone. Fearless reporter Lois Lane is a mommy. But if you ask me, she's still in love with you-know-who.
How could you leave us like that? I moved on. So did the rest of us. The world doesn't need a savior. And neither do I. Lex Luthor.
This is kind of a little reunion, isn't it? Heck, I'm a fan.
I'll have
advanced technology.
thousands of years beyond what anyone could throw at me.
But millions of people will die.
Billions!
You wrote that the world doesn't need a savior, but every day I hear people crying for one.
Come on, let me hear you say it just once.
You're insane.
No! No, the other thing.
Superman will never...
Bring it on! Now fly.
Superman has been absent from Earth for 5 years, having left to investigate remnants of his former homeworld of Krypton. Having found nothing, he returns to find Lois Lane engaged to another man and a mother to a young boy. Meanwhile, Lex Luthor is formulating another real estate scheme, but this time using Kryptonian crystals to form a whole new continent that threatens to kill billions of people around the globe. Superman must now thwart Lex's plan while also finding his place in this new modern world that he left years ago.
Pretty good general synopsis of Superman Returns. Chris, since you have less familiar, or less of an attachment to the character, as we just talked about before the trailer, I'd like to hear you go first. I mean, you've already said this is your fourth time watching it, but let's hear, what do you think now? How has that evolved? Spill the beans on Superman Returns.
Sure. So one anecdote I left out when my knowledge of this movie in general, I used to work at Best Buy with a friend of mine. And, back in the day when people used to go to Best Buys and buy TVs, they would always send us, this is when Blu-ray was coming out in 2006, 2007, Blu-ray was really taking off. So, Sony and everything and WB would always send us demo discs. So these demo discs would be in all the TVs. So every single time somebody pressed a button, to show the demo, it would show a montage of a bunch of movies, right? And Superman Returns was a big part of it, into the montage. And I swear to you, I have heard Kevin Spacey scream wrong about 2,000 times.
Yeah. Big trailer moment as well. Yeah.
Yes, huge trailer moment. But I've heard that. So when I told my friend that we'd be looking at this movie, I texted him that anecdote and to remind him, and we just burst out laughing. It's just so funny. That wrong is I might drop it a million times in this episode. So we'll see how it goes when I edit.
Come on, let me hear you say it just once. Come on.
You're insane.
No! No, the other thing. Come on, I know it's just dangling out the tip of your tongue. Let me hear it just once, please.
Superman will never...
Wrong!
Yeah, saw it twice in theaters, and then I watched it. Funnily enough, I had forgotten this. So I actually watched this movie. I'm looking at my Letterboxd review right now. I watched it June 3rd, 2016. And I'm going to read you my review, okay?
Okay.
And then I'm going to respond to myself as well.
All right.
I'm getting meta on this episode. No question, Singer gets Superman. But I find this far too slavish to the old Donner films, while still acting as a sequel to them. The pacing is pretty terrible. The airplane sequence is amazing, though, plus the bullet to the eye visual. Those two moments really capture his heroics and strength without the use of murder, cough, Zack Snyder, cough. Okay? I gave this movie 2 out of 4 stars. Mm-hmm. I'm going to come into this episode and disagree with myself from 7 years ago. I think what I said, some of those things we will be addressing in this episode, but I loved this viewing this time around. Yeah. This was my favorite of the 4 viewings I've had of this movie. Dude, this was honestly a breath of fresh air. It's from a different era of superhero movies. It's not trying to one-up everything. I remember the critiques that I mentioned there, saying it was long and boring and actionless. Dude, I didn't feel that at all. There was plenty of action and meaningful action, which we will get into. This introduces the character to a new generation while still servicing the old fans. Yes, it's nostalgia heavy, but there's a romantic elegance to the filmmaking and just the character in general. And I'm telling you, I loved this viewing. I really, really did. I'm not trying to be flippant. I'm not trying to be silly. Nothing. I'm totally earnest as the way Superman is as a character. this was a great viewing. I really enjoyed it. I made sure to watch it Saturday night. I had it to myself. I made snacks. I watched it the way a movie should be made, or should be watched. Sorry, and I loved it. I loved it.
Well, it's funny that you say it's like you mentioned how it doesn't feel like a superhero movie of like this generation and like or this time, but when it came out, it wasn't even a superhero movie of its time.
Sure,
right?
Yeah,
Like
you're right.
It's specifically a reaction to the Donner films of like the late 70s and early 80s, and that's what Singer was trying to replicate it. And like so, in your initial review, you mentioned and that's one of the most common criticisms of this movie is it's too slavishly devoted to replicating the Donner films, and I don't even disagree with that. I think that's a valid critique, and certainly we'll talk about it. But I mean, I'm definitely with you in that I really like this movie a lot. I loved it in the theater. So as someone who grew up, loving the Donner movies and the Christopher Reeve Superman series in general, and then it obviously going away when it got a little shaky with 3 and definitely 4. But like, and we talked before about how I was a comic book kid my whole life, and like I sat through years of, okay, there's maybe 1 or 2 good comic book movies every once in a while, but the most of them are just total bullshit. Right. And we're like waiting for comic book movies to be good and for them to be respectable and feel like something you're not embarrassed to see. But I want to specifically concentrate on the fact that like loving those Superman movies as a kid, Chris, I can't even tell you what it felt like to sit in the theater to see this. And the moment that John Williams score hits and the opening credits start and they're the same style opening credits as the Donner films, like it did make me emotional. And I absolutely loved this in the theater. Because I was just like, I was so over the moon for it in the theater. Because I was just like, this is everything I wanted a new Superman movie to be. Because it's just going back to the basics. I've had like an evolving relationship with this movie. Because I think I actually did have a time a few years later where I was like, yes, I like it. But I do think it's like heavily flawed or whatever.
Sure.
And now like you, I think I've come back around to just being like, well, I still see some flaws and we'll talk about them. But overall, I love it. And you know what it is that I've heard people say, if you ever see a movie and don't like it, that's fine, but don't necessarily say I'll never watch that movie again.
Yeah.
Because movies don't change, but you change. And your relationship to a movie can change over the years. And there's certainly movies I've liked and then turn out not to like later and vice versa. But I think what has happened with this movie is time has been very kind to this movie because where it felt really out of time and really out of place at a point where everyone was just wanted comic movies to be exciting again and dark and gritty and full of propulsive action. Now we've had all of that shoved so far up our ass that this does feel like a breath of fresh air in a way it didn't in 2006, unfortunately for it. But like this is like a really nice contrast now to like the bombacity of the superhero genre. And you said this movie feels like very romantic, very like classical, and that's exactly what I respond to now. I mean, yes, there are some still issues with it. I think there's some story, like foibles with it and things like that.
Sure.
But overall, I do think this is a really good superhero movie. And importantly, if this is what Singer was going for, it is a beautiful tribute to the Donner films. Yeah. And a really nice capper to those as well. Like it does, like this does in your mind, you can in heart, this does make up for Superman 3 and 4 if you want to just view it as a trilogy now.
I'm so glad you said that you say that you evolve as a person, right? Movies won't fundamentally change, but you change with it and your reactions to it. I was talking to a friend, the one that I actually went to go see this with in 2006, and I texted him how much I loved it this time. And then I was like, oh, wow, I found my review. I totally forgot I watched it back in 2016. Well, just in 2016, I was going through some stuff and I wasn't really in the mood to watch a romantic movie. We'll just say it that way, okay? And so it didn't shock me that I was so down on this one, right? Now I'm a much better place, much better everything, and I just felt this so uplifting. This movie was so just really hit me, right? And I think I'm an emotional person. You know that. You know that being a close friend of mine, not just your co-host. But I think like I'm an emotional person, and I review things with emotionality and how I feel at the time too, right? For better or for worse, And I think this is one of those movies that absolutely people should revisit. Don't think about the critiques of it being slow and boring and actionless, because those are lies. The movie does such a great job of not only being an incredible tribute to those old films, but it reintroduces Superman to a modern era, and it does it with such grace. Like it shows his powers almost one by one, but in the most naturalistic, beautiful way. It's not like, hey, remember that Superman can look through walls? No, he looks through an elevator to watch where Lois is going, so he can go meet up with her later, and stuff like that. Like, or listening into a room on something because it's steeped in character. You know what I mean? He's lifting things because he needs to, and I can go. I'm getting goosebumps because I'm thinking about the action scenes right now, but it just feels so natural and so good. Like, I'm talking about the scene where he sees Lois going up into this elevator and he goes to meet her up at the rooftop, right? And the scene when he's flying with Lois is so beautifully staged and shot. The music is so simplistic and not bombastic at all. You know, it's just, I keep going to the word elegant. You know, it just shows, you know, how you can romanticize Superman as a character, you know, and their relationship in general. And I think that's something so fascinating to watch. And by this moment, it's the middle of the movie. And I wrote in my notes, we're at the halfway mark, and this is a near perfect Superman movie. Like, all in.
I'm so glad you just said that about romanticizing the character, because you and I have both already called this a romantic movie.
Yeah.
And for anyone listening, I want people to understand, I'm going to speak for you for a moment, Chris, but I think you're going to agree with what I'm going to say. When we call this a romantic movie, we're not just talking about the Superman and Lois story, because honestly, that story does have some like kind of like questionable story elements to it, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, and like the romance might be like a little iffy here. But when I say it's a romantic movie, I'm talking about how the movie it romanticizes the essence of Superman.
Yeah, same.
This movie just has a very romantic view of what that character is and what he means to the world. And honestly, like what you just said, like some of my I'm not here to say it's better than the Donner movies. I'm not that crazy, right? And I don't want the comic book fans in the world to come after me and murder me. I still prefer Superman 1 and 2 to this.
Sure.
But I will say this movie has an advantage of also being able to look at those and say, well, what can we improve on with those movies? And like where did those go too corny, and where can we dial back? So I think I mentioned this in the Supergirl movie, but this is the first movie in that series that doesn't make up some like nonsense power for Superman. He doesn't pull off his shield and throw it at anybody. He doesn't like fly around the earth and turn time backwards. He doesn't make anyone forget with a kiss. You know, this power set in this is from the comics. And you talked about the moment where he takes Lois up in the sky. If you remember in the original Donner film, that leads to that really weird moment that I like, and on an ironic sense, but where like Lois like thinks to herself when we hear her thoughts, and she has that like poem that she reads, and it's like, oh God, it's just so so corny, right?
Yeah.
And here, this movie like dials back from that. But yeah, this movie it's not my favorite Superman movie. It's not my favorite media version of Superman, but I will say this movie by far has some of my all-time favorite Superman moments I've ever seen. I mean, like you were just like that scene where he takes her up in the sky. Like, you know, we're going to bounce around, I'm sure, as we talk about this, especially whenever you and I like are really excited about a movie, we bounce around a lot.
Yeah, we do.
But that scene, you know, it's following, he's been gone for 5 years, as you said, and in his absence, Lois is kind of, you know, turned on the idea of Superman. And she's written this essay or this article, which she's won a Pulitzer for, called Why the World Doesn't Need a Superman.
Mm-hmm.
And she's kind of confronting him with that again on the roof, saying, you know, like, you left and the world trudged on without you. And like the world doesn't need a savior. We've learned that. And when he takes her up in the sky and he tells her, like, you know, you say the world doesn't need a savior, but every moment I hear the world crying out for one. Like, that just gets like, I get emotional thinking about that, because it's like, that's the essence of Superman.
What do you hear?
Nothing.
I hear everything. You wrote that the world doesn't need a savior. But every day I hear people crying for one.
The moment that precedes that like validates that line, one of my favorite things I've ever seen in a Superman movie, the moment where they just show him go up in space and like wait with his eyes closed, and he just listens. He listens all around the world and waits to hear somebody who needs help, and then flies down to do that. And it's like, that's exactly what I want to see in a Superman movie. Like this movie gets his essence, arguably like as good as, if not better than, any other Superman media thing.
Oh yeah, like there's later on in the movie, there's a big earthquake that's happening in Metropolis, and he's flying around and saving people all over the place in different ways, using his powers so creatively and fun, but also like it's urgent. I saw somebody say that this movie has no again, I saw glacial pace, somebody called it. I saw somebody say that it never shows urgency. Well, guess what?
Wrong!
it is consistently showing you fun, good Superman moments, and it's again steeped in the character, right? And then it goes back to romanticizing him. You know, the plane rescue scene is one of the most spectacular displays of heroism that I've seen in the genre, and still to this day, the VFX hold up, and it's this amazing moment when he saves the day and brings the plane down into the baseball stadium. And then this is the moment also that he's kind of reintroducing himself on the world stage to the characters in the film, right? Mm-hmm. And he walks in the thing and he looks at Lois immediately and goes, "You okay?" And then all the reporters in the plane look at her all odd. And then he does this beautiful... Let's talk about him. Let's talk about Brandon Routh right now, because he encapsulates Christopher Reeve incredibly.
Yes.
And he says right here is when I got goosebumps again. He looks around, he realizes that, okay, I shouldn't be really just focusing on her. And he goes, statistically speaking, it's still the fastest way to travel. Or it's the safest way to travel is in a plane ride. So hopefully this doesn't discourage you.
The same line. It's a line from the 78 Superman.
Right. Oh, okay. So yeah, there you go. But it's the way is the problem that he's doing an imitation? Is that what people are mad at? Because I thought he still made it his own. Like, how do you feel about this?
It's strange. It's hard because I think he was expected and asked to do an imitation, but I mean that's still a skill set.
Exactly.
Not everyone can pull off that imitation. And it's like, is it fair to say that he's doing just a Christopher Reeve imitation, or is it more fair to say both him and Christopher Reeve got this character
totally
and perform the character the way it should be? I think that's more the case. Obviously he looks like Christopher Reeve. Even Dana Reeve, Christopher Reeve's widow, was blown away at the time when she said she saw him, and she said you couldn't have cast him better. He just looks like him.
Yeah,
and he does he does nail that spirit. I love Brandon Routh in this. I think he's a great Superman. I think he's a fantastic Clark Kent.
He nails that awkward goofball innocence.
Oh, it's so good. Yeah, I think his Clark Kent is different than Christopher Reeve. That's the thing. Whenever I see people say he's just doing a Christopher Reeve impression, I think that really locks in more with people on Superman. But it's how many ways can you play Superman? It's kind of tough, right?
Totally.
If you're playing this just good, all romanticized version. But his Clark is definitely different. His Clark feels a little bit more. He has a more young, impish energy to him a little bit. Not impish, but he seems more young and naive than Christopher Reeve did in that part. Christopher Reeve was playing it more over the top, SNL, SCTV nerd.
Right.
And I think Brandon Routh is doing it more subtly. In fact, I think another thing we should say about this movie is much funnier than I remembered it being.
Yes,
it's a very funny movie, and a lot of that humor is very, very subtle. And I liked how subtle the humor was, but a lot of it hits for me.
I want to talk a little bit about some cons, maybe not a con, but I want to maybe pick your brain on this. But I was a little surprised, and I had forgotten that Brandon Routh doesn't even speak until the 20-minute mark, and that surprised me. And I also was wanting to wonder, I wanted your thoughts on, should this have done more of a more cinematic way of introducing Brandon Routh as the new Superman? Or do you think the subtlety of it is what works? What do you think?
Well, the introduction of Superman I think is great because it's the plane sequence.
Yes,
so
of
you
course.
mean just seeing Brandon Routh and as Clark and bringing him into I'm glad you asked this question because we're going to talk about now the glacial pace and what people don't like about this movie, and it allows me to talk both about the pace and about some story elements. Because I know this is a common critique, and even you and I have a friend who will constantly talk about how this movie makes Superman. You can look at this movie in a certain way and say it makes him into a deadbeat dad, and
right.
It makes him into a shittier character because he left the Earth for 5 years, right? And I think I understand sort of where people are coming from on that, although I think it's a kind of a cynical misread of the film, a purposely cynical misread of the film.
Yeah.
Because I think it's very valid to say, if he found out Krypton might still exist or any piece of it, he would go off and look for it. And I think what the problem is that what they don't make clear at the beginning of the movie is the idea that just because he's Superman doesn't mean he can fly anywhere in a second.
Totally.
So even in the comics, there were times where Superman had to go into space and still had to actually get on a spaceship or like a space shuttle. And people will like post those pictures all the time and they'll be like, well, why is he like flying a shuttle? He can be in space. And it's like, yeah, but there are some places where they're so far, he still needs the shuttle to take him there. And it's still going to take a long time. And I think the idea here is that maybe he didn't know he was going to be gone 5 years, but that's how long this took. And Bryan Singer has talked about how, and I'm sure you saw this too in your notes, they filmed a sequence of him like finding the destruction of Krypton, like getting to space and actually finding like, you know, what was left and then heading back. And I do think that should have been the opening of the movie. Because I think him just kind of coming back to the farm, and like you said, we don't hear him talk or anything for a bit. It's a little too confusing, and without that sequence showing what he found and allowing us to really feel more of the pain of what happened when he was out there, and maybe getting a sense of why this journey was so long, then you do kind of have this like, well, that's weird that he left for 5 years without like telling everyone where he was going, you know? So I kind of like that critique is hurt by the fact that they cut that sequence.
It's weird too because the sequence is like $10 million. Like it was a huge chunk of change, tons of VFX, and like you're saying, it works on a character level and even just like a plot level. Like you the viewer gets it right away. So I definitely understand why it feels maybe, I don't want to use the word icky when he shows up back, like when he comes back, but a little bit like where you been.
Well, this is where the slavish fealty to the Donner film does get in the way. And I will say, like I said, I love this movie, but I do think that's a valid critique because I do think sometimes it hurts the movie. And I think in the editing room, they were probably looking at that, probably saying, how can we cut this down a little? We want this to be about 2.5 hours, not 2:45.
Right.
What can we lose? And I'm sure the answer to Singer was, well, in the original Donner film, which should be, like, people should remember, the Donner film takes a very long time to get to Superman. We get his whole childhood and teenage years first, But the introduction to Superman in the 78 movie is the sequence where he saves Lois on the helicopter and then delivers the same line about air travel. And so I bet you Singer was like, well, if we take out that Krypton sequence at the beginning, then the first time we'll see Superman is when he saves the plane, just like the Donner movie. So, like, that's probably what they were thinking.
It's funny, too, because even in recent years, well, maybe not recent years, in 2011, Singer was talking about this movie when he was still allowed to give interviews. And he was saying that if he was to do it over again, he would have cut out basically most of the first quarter of the movie and then put the plane sequence right up front. And then also, he was definitely more interested in making it a reboot. So... yeah. That was weird to hear.
And I think he's wrong. And
I agree.
Shockingly, Bryan Singer was wrong about something. I think that's him reacting the wrong way to criticism of the movie. And I don't wish anything good on this guy, but sometimes when you read something like that, I think people need to not listen to the critics, be more proud of the movie they made, and I think people just need to learn patience. There's no problem with the fact that it takes a while to get to Superman in this movie. The movie's called Superman Returns. We know he's coming. You can build up to it. I don't need to see the plane sequence in the first 5 minutes. I like that the movie first shows him, that there's that nice little moment with him and his mom on the farm talking. Even the moment with the flashback to show the first time he realized he could fly as a kid. And then going back to the Daily Planet for the first time, like, I'm fine with the slow build up. So to see him say like, yeah, people didn't like it, I guess I should have had an action scene. No, you don't just second guess yourself just because the movie wasn't as big of a hit as it could have been. You have to second guess yourself because you're a monster. But if we were just talking about this movie,
Yeah, allegedly.
Yeah.
Allegedly.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. I want to ask you this question too, because earlier you said this is just a beautiful capper, to the Donner saga, let's just say, and Christopher Reeve's, entries. Again, I want to pick your brain. Is that an issue as well? Is this movie too much of a end rather than it should be a new beginning, right? Like, is this more of a swan song? Does it come off that way? And is that why audiences, obviously, most people did like it. This was critically, well received.
Yeah, pretty well received, yeah.
But do you think the fandom, because you especially, you are the fandom in my eyes, but did they want something super new, super fresh? Did they want it to give seeds of what's to come versus capping off everything in this like nostalgia fest?
Yeah, so to be fair, we should say the movie does do that. Like when I call it a capper, let's be honest, it's not like the movie has just a definitive ending that allows no space for more. Like
right.
you can it ends and there's still like, him and Lois are not back together yet. In fact, Lois is still with the other man in her life, Richard. The son has still not learned he's Superman's son. We're getting into spoilers now, but like whatever. So there's it's not all answered. I think the problem is that this movie doesn't end on the sort of cliffhanger or the sort of tease of what's to come next that comic book audiences are more trained to want, right? Yeah. Like with the Marvel movies, the tease is like the next villain and like what's the next big action thing going to be. And this movie is teasing more of an emotional like cliffhanger, right? Like
totally.
How does his relationship, where does his relationship with Lois go from here, right? That's what this movie is asking at the end. And that's not enough for a certain kind of audience. So like, yeah, it's bittersweet because I think this works as like just a trilogy now, but I also think it does leave enough open at the end where if you like this movie like you and I do, I am bummed we don't get to see the continuation of it. This movie was also like very ahead of its time. I want to talk about this a little bit because we just mentioned a very important plot point in this is that he comes back after being gone for 5 years. So does, what's weird? Oddly enough, at the same time, Clark Kent comes back from a 5-year mission abroad. A trip abroad. And gets his job back at the Daily Planet. Obviously is very excited to meet up with Lois again, only to find out that Lois is engaged to a Richard White, Perry White's nephew, who is also like an assistant editor at the Daily Planet now, played by James Marsden. I have a lot to say about this character later, as I'm sure you do too.
Yeah.
She also has a young son who is 5 years old. Interesting, Yeah. And the movie, I don't think it's hard to see coming, but the movie ultimately...
it's the movie... This is where the movie... Okay, I would say my issues are with the third act, right? Yeah. And I think the movie is playing it as a mystery, but it's also like a no shit, right?
Yeah.
And then when the reveal happens in the third act, you sit there being like, yeah, no shit. So... It's one of those, again, have your cake, eat it too moments that it just never quite gels as well as it maybe should.
Well, but this is where I do think the script is a little sloppy because it does make you start, as you're watching the movie, you start to have to ask yourself questions of the timeline. And because of this, the sloppiness of the script sometimes does get in the way and makes the characters shittier than they probably intended them to.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you, I was watching this with my girlfriend, and she was like really hating on Lois in this movie. And we should talk about that because like it kind of makes sense because she's saying like there's like Lois goes up on the roof and almost kisses Superman again, and she's kind of having this like emotional relationship with him as soon as he shows up again, and Liz just kept saying like, you're engaged to this guy and he's a really good guy.
Liz, that's fucking Superman though, okay? And I know you're trying to say that. Yeah, I know you're trying to say that because Trev's in the room, but come on. Between you, yourself, and the wall, and all your girlfriends, Superman fucking takes you out to a flight. And this, I'm talking directly to you, Liz, because I know you listen sometimes.
But here's what I think the movie needed. I think this would fix a lot of that, or at least one crucial mistake that they make in the writing, is that it's pretty clear in the movie that Richard does believe the son, Jason is his name, I think, right? The young son.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, Richard does believe that's his son. Mm-hmm. Which means for him to believe that the timeline makes sense, for him to have that be his son, that means Lois did sleep with both Superman and Richard pretty close together in time, which is kind of weird because
he went out, he went off to space. She was feeling down on her luck. She went out, hooked up. Here we go.
No, well, yeah, but so that's how the relationship. But I mean, that's not the romanticized version I think they're going for.
But I guess the romanticization isn't with Richard though, right? So I don't.
Yeah.
He is just the other guy. James Marsden is the king of the other guy.
I think it might have been more interesting if they played it in the movie that had some dialogue where it's revealed that James Marsden's character Richard has always known that's not his son. He just doesn't know who. Yeah. And she's always said like, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about who the father is, because there's a whole through line of the movie where once Superman shows back up, he keeps kind of questioning about that relationship. And it would have been really interesting if he starts to kind of put the pieces together and go, is it possible that he's the father? Because imagine that. Imagine like you're with this woman, you love her, you love the son now. Even you're like you see him as your son. But you don't know who the father is, and then you start to think like, oh my God, is the father Superman? Like imagine like the tension of that.
Well, now that we're talking it out right now, I don't think he's ever super clear that it's his kid.
Yeah,
I think because now that I'm thinking about it, truly, I'm replaying it in my head here. I don't think there's ever like a moment where he is like, yeah, I'm his I'm his father. He is maybe just the other guy that met this pregnant girl. You know, like, but to answer your question, I think a line of dialogue is needed, you know, to make that clear. So I push back on the definitive way Richard feels about Jason as his child, but to your credit, you are not wrong to put one line of dialogue at least explaining that.
Yeah, because you have to start to put together some of these pieces for yourself. You even have to ask yourself, like, what was the situation? Because she, in this movie, she still doesn't know that Clark Kent is Superman. Right. So, like, but it's very clear, like, her and Superman were never necessarily a couple either. So, like, what was the situation? And my headcanon is that when he knew he was going to leave, because he talks about how he couldn't tell he was going to leave, it was too hard, but he probably went to see her, and, like, that's the night that he ended up sleeping with her.
Yeah.
And then kind of took off the next day. And obviously to her, that's like really heartbreaking. And again, to like the criticism of like our friend and some others, that does make Superman seem like kind of a dick, you know, on like an emotional level, to like sleep with someone and then peace out. Yeah. You have to just accept his like notion of like, it was just too hard for me to say. And like the thing about Superman, like this goes back to the discussion about him being too good of a character.
Yeah.
I think that moment is like, is where the lie is put to that. Because Superman does make mistakes.
Yep.
And he can fuck up on things. And the fact that he did do that, like the fact that, you know what, he actually was wrong to like leave and not explain it to Lois Lane. He's allowed to make mistakes. Superman doesn't have to be all perfect. And I think whenever like a character, like people put that notion on him, so then it becomes a criticism of the character. If they're like, oh, well, he's a piece of shit. He's like stalking her in this because he's looking to the wall and stuff. It's like, no, he's still human also. You know, he was raised human. He makes human mistakes. Anyways.
I want to say I'm so happy you said that because it did help my critiques of the character as well. And that's why as I get older, right, you go through more experiences in life. You learn a lot more about yourself, your emotions, your feelings and everything. And I feel like, you know, people, like you said, people make mistakes. Superman is allowed to make mistakes. You know, people make the joke that he's stalking, like you said, Lois, from watching her in her house while she's talking to James Marsden and all this other stuff. It's like, no, he fucking misses her. And like you know, he has the power to fly around in X-ray vision. You know, he's not looking at her naked, but he's looking through the walls. Like, he's just like, oh, I messed up.
In fact, if he looked through the wall and she was naked, he would instantly stop looking.
Yes, exactly.
And actually, the movie is flat out telling you that Superman makes mistakes. That's the thing. Is like when people criticize that, they're ignoring that the movie is admitting that he fucked up by going and leaving for this long and not letting people know, because like with the whole thing about Lex Luthor getting out of prison, that's on him, and he realizes that now. Like he gets like, oh, I screwed up because I wasn't there to make sure I was supposed to be a character witness in his appeal process. That's why he was released, and he understands that. So this movie is largely about him having to grapple with the fact that not just like reintroduce himself to this world, but reintroduce himself with like the wake of what he left behind when he took off. To finally get to my point,
a Trev standard here.
Yeah, I know, but I said this movie was ahead of its time actually, because another really common critique, and this goes back to what you're saying about, did the movie give the kind of cliffhanger fans want? I know something a lot of fans didn't like about this movie was him having a son. And like they're just like, oh god, they gave Superman a kid, and the kid's like not that interesting. He's like this little kid with asthma, and the turns out superpowers, lame, stupid. that felt pretty revolutionary in 2006. The idea of like the movie ending with him having a son, and like, you know, the climax of this film is him going into the kid's room while he's sleeping and giving him the same speech Jor-El gave him, and looking very happy to have a son now. But then, as we said, flying off with not telling the son necessarily. So there's still a question of how it's going to develop, and obviously that would have been explored in the sequels. Since this movie, that's just become like an ingrained part of Superman mythology now. In the comics, Superman and Lois have had a son, Jonathan, who is like now grown into teenage years and is another version of Superman alongside his father.
Right.
On the current CW show, Superman and Lois, different continuity, but they have twin teenage sons. So it's like this movie was actually the first to do that, and now it's just a thing. So it's like the thing that everyone hated in 2006, like actually this movie was just kind of getting to it first. And whenever people would like critique this movie and say like, oh, the son thing's lame and it doesn't have a great like hook for the next film, my guess was, and I don't know for sure, but my guess was always that one of the values of having the son was that a common criticism of the Superman character, which you talked about before, is the idea that he's too powerful and he doesn't have a lot of like physical opponents that can take him. I was just like, oh, well, maybe the son is going to turn bad in one of the movies. Now, I do think it would be like a Star Wars kind of thing where he's like, he doesn't turn completely villainous. Like there's probably some kind of redemption, but he's somehow, Lex Luthor gets to him or some other villain gets to him, convinces him to go against his father, and you could have like Superman versus Jason. So I thought that was like the value of that, which nobody ever necessarily talked about, but I could see that as like a potential, future movie.
I immediately pictured Jason Voorhees and your two franchises coming together.
Well, then the other thing that would like be good about that, about him turning evil in a movie, would solve another issue or problem that you might have moving forward. And I want to bring this problem up because I want to talk about this character now, as like something I really liked about the movie, is with any sequels, the question would have to come up: what do we do with Richard? Because the movie ends and Richard and Lois are still together, and Richard is like a great guy, and you don't want Lois to just like dump him for Superman, And the movie wisely, I think, doesn't do that. But you could have an evil Jason kill Richard in a sequel
off screen.
Yes, of course. That's setting the stage again for Lois and Superman to finally get together. But I want to talk about Richard because this is another thing I think is great about this movie, is that in 99 out of 100 movies like this, Richard would be revealed to be cheating on Lois, or he'd be like some secret piece of shit.
Totally.
And I love that he is actually the greatest guy in the world in this movie. He puts up with Lois's like clear obsession with Superman. He's very understanding of it. He's arguably more heroic than Superman in this movie, because when Lois and Jason get into danger on Lex's yacht and the ship is sinking and they find out, he's a pilot and he flies his plane to save them. When Superman does that, you're like, yeah, you're Superman. You don't think anything's going to happen to you. But Richard doesn't have superpowers.
No.
He is really risking his life and like life and limb to go save the woman he loves and his son. So I love that he's like so heroic. And I think James Marsden is so good in this movie. And it's like, again, I know that's just the story of his career. You watch this and you go like, oh, this character should be the star of his own movie. And like this guy is just like everything a movie star should be. What is going on, Hollywood?
Yeah. No, and I love that you're talking about the positivity of their relationship. Me and you have talked about this a lot privately and maybe on this podcast at some point. But we were big fans of the show Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and there's certain characters in that show that get together and they go through normal relationship stuff. Like it doesn't take cheating or being shitty or domestic abuse of some sort, to add drama. It's fine to have a great person as your character, especially if they're played by, a handsome James Marsden, right? With like just innate charisma. And I think him, especially involving him in the action, is genius, because when at the end, like I have my issues with the third act, which I really want to get to right away here, but you nailed it. He goes there without care about himself. He's going to do everything to save his family. And there's a moment where they're in a ship and it's broken off and it's falling into the sea. And it's extraordinarily tense. Basically, Richard, the kid, and Lois are at the top of this door and you can see out into the sky. But it's sinking into the ocean, and the door slams shut, and it knocks Lois out, and then the lights are all off, and again now we're going into the depths of the ocean, and the camera stays with Richard, holding his presumed son and holding Lois Lane's passed out or knocked out body, and he's just like totally hopeless, and. It's an incredible, it leads to an incredible Superman moment, because like you said, and again, more goosebumps on me right now, is when you hear that theme kick in, that John Williams theme kick in, you can tell in James Marsden's performance, he realizes that everything's gonna be fine. Like it's this amazing switch from complete and utter despair and hopelessness to the moment where Superman stands onto the ship, and right away Richard kicks back into gear and he's like, oh yeah, we're gonna be fine, we're gonna get out of this, we'll be fine. And it's like this amazing switch. And you're so right, there more should be said about the character of Richard White in this movie, but definitely James Marsden. He brings such a fascinating emotionality to the movie, and was a big fan of him. That's
what I think was honestly one of the biggest losses of not getting sequels to this, because like I said, I just love that they actually made a very complicated love triangle, where it's like, it is like even when the movie ends, it's still complicated, and like you said, there's no call to just have Lois dumped this guy. He's a good guy. He's not a piece of shit. So like, I like that the movie was like willing to do that and say like, Superman might be pining after Lois, but he really does have no right to necessarily insert himself into her life anymore in that way. But also, he does know that's his son now, and obviously he's going to want a relationship with him. And what does that look like? All right.
Let's talk about him.
Let's pull the Band-Aid off. Yeah.
Okay. Pre-allegations and craziness. I loved Kevin Spacey. Okay.
Same.
Love. An ex-girlfriend of mine, it was her favorite actor. We would watch every single movie he came out with. We watched it together. We would rewatch them ad nauseum. Kevin Spacey, to me, when he was in a movie, it was like insta-buy, Like, he was, let's just say, one of the great actors of our time. And I just, I know we're not supposed to talk, say anything good about the guy anymore, but I have to get that out of the way that, man, Kevin Spacey, like, it sucks. It's a fucking bummer. More than a lot of these other allegation type actors and this and that. But this one was a bummer to find out because he is so good as Lex Luthor, in my opinion. And he adds like this new, who knew that he would be so good at being sinister? But he's so good in this movie. And he has this line that I absolutely loved when he's getting in an argument with Kitty Kowalski. And Kitty's talking about Superman, about gods and this and that. And Lex goes, gods fly around in little red capes and don't share their power. Yeah. And just a killer line from the antagonist of the movie. So I really liked him in this movie.
That was great because he's playing the Gene Hackman version of Lex, who is just like a real estate like scammer. And I know that's like another thing people don't like. And it's like, yeah, maybe his like plan on this could be like a little bit more interesting and not just a redo of like what Gene Hackman was doing in the first movie. Yeah. But I like that they mixed in enough of like the comic book Lex to like that line right there is like, that's the comic Lex right there. Yeah. A guy who just like hates what Superman represents and how he represents something better than humanity. And that like offends Lex Luthor. Like Lex Luthor looks at Superman as like an affront to like human potential. Totally. Because he just gets these advantages that we don't all have. He's so good in this. There's a moment I talked about the comedy of this movie and how subtle it is. A lot of that comes from Kevin Spacey, and especially his like scenes with Kitty Kowalski. But like there's a moment in this that I think is like so indicative of what a good like actor he is, however you want to put it. It's the moment where after the son's powers are revealed, one of Lex's henchmen is kind of about to like beat the crap out of his mom, and the son suddenly throws a piano at the henchman, and like. Just based on timeline alone, Kevin Spacey has already started. Lex Luthor has already started to suspect Jason might be Superman's son. Yeah. But then he kind of like pushes off the idea. He's like, no, probably not. But then
he tests him though. That's the reason why he's off of it. He puts
tries
a
the
kryptonite.
It doesn't do anything. Yeah. So then we see, and the camera's just on Spacey. He's looking dead into center of frame, and another henchman comes and says, we had a problem. I don't remember the guy's name, but he's like, whatever has been killed. A piano is thrown on him.
We had a little problem downstairs. Brutus is dead. He got hit with the piano.
Next time anybody watches this movie, just watch Spacey's face during that entire scene, because he goes from says nothing, but he goes from being annoyed that he's being interrupted, being confused when he finds out one of his henchmen has been murdered, and then after being told the thing about the piano, you see it click into his head where he goes like, oh shit, that kid is Superman's son.
Where's the boy?
With the mother. Locked up in the pantry.
Oh, it's time for us to go.
And it's just such a great like non-verbal performance, and I was like, man, damn, this guy's good.
And then he's like, we gotta go. Like they have to leave immediately.
But he's very fun in this. Like he's very funny in this, but like never too funny to not be sinister. I mean, the moment where he is like actually like murdering Superman and stabs him with the crystal, he is actually scary in that moment.
Oh yeah.
You're asking yourself, didn't your dad ever teach you to laugh before you leap?
You know, like it's the perfect villain performance, and that's the thing is like that's what you say like how much of a bummer it is for like the Kevin Spacey thing, and like let's say it's always more of a bummer, obviously because of the victims and what they went
yeah,
through.
for sure.
But what I will say like too, like yes, that's true because I was also a Kevin Spacey fan. But then when you hear those allegations, you find out everything allegedly about him. Then you think about all the characters you did like him as, and you go like, oh yeah, I guess there's a reason he was really good at particularly playing like scumbags, you know?
Yeah,
like,
totally.
It's
Yeah,
yeah, he's fantastic. I mean, he
so
is fantastic in this. I mean, there's just if you can only talk about his skill set, this does show how good he was, and he's obviously an MVP in this movie.
Remember
Katie Kowalski also, Parker Posey, awesome in this too,
oh yeah,
obviously.
I love the moment when she's supposed to pretend the brakes are cut on her car, and it's kind of confusing because you're watching the movie and she's obviously in distress driving through Metropolis in a control, she can't control her car, so you're sitting there being like, what's wrong with her car? Like, what? She's obviously trying to play the role, but it's like not working. And then it's just like revealed a couple scenes later that Lex cut the brakes. And she was like, I could have pretended, and he's just like, no, I don't.
And she plays her moments very well too, of like the moments where you see Kitty realizing Lex is too evil, and like she shouldn't have gotten wrapped up with this guy, and actually starting to like, oh no, what he's planning, he's going to kill billions of people. I'm not behind this. Like she does all of that very well.
Dude, one of the most sinister moments that you're actually scared of Lex is when he's again not looking at her, and she just subtly goes, "Are billions of people actually going to die?" And there's like this really long pause, and Lex is like looking down. He's just like getting his stuff ready, and he just says like matter of fact, yes.
Yeah.
And it's just like, whoa, it's just so good.
But it's just a business calculation for him. That's all.
Okay, can I talk about the final act, please?
Yeah. Well, right before you say that, I just want to quickly say, first of all, we haven't talked at all about Cal Penn at Stanford. Obviously, his greatest role of all time. Cal Penn is in this as one of Lex Luthor's henchmen. I think he has like one line, maybe. You know, knowing what he became after this, it's very funny to see how he just does nothing in this.
Yeah.
But I will say, cast-wise, do you agree with me? Kate Bosworth is unfortunately the weak link here.
I did at the time when I watched this years ago. I didn't find it. I think she was still. The chemistry and stuff still work for me. It might have to do with that she's so young. She's 20. She's 22 years old.
She's too young to play this version of Lois for sure.
Yes.
And I think, and so this is like, because we don't like to shit talk actors, so I want to make clear, I'm not shit talking Kate Bosworth. I'm more shit talking the version of Lois they're asking her to play.
In this episode, you're shit talking Kate Bosworth and you're uplifting Kevin Spacey. Isn't that crazy? Who would have thought? I know.
God, you know what? Just cancel this podcast. What are we doing here?
Go on.
But like, she has none of like the spunk and like comedic like craziness of Margot Kidder's Lois Lane.
No, she doesn't.
I think that's missing. Like they try to give her that one little bit where she doesn't know how to spell catastrophic, which was a big thing with Margot Kidder's Lois, where she was always asking how to spell things. But otherwise, they just play her as like mom, right? And then like the mom who's upset at her ex for leaving, and it's like, oh yeah, but Lois was like funny and like just such a strange person, and like that's what Lois needs to be, because like. It, like you said, we were talking about this earlier, but it's Superman. Superman can have his pick of probably any woman on Earth. What is it about Lois?
Including Liz.
What is it about Lois that like would get him? So like she needs to have some kind of spark. And I just think, I don't know, I don't get that from Kate Bosworth. So I don't hold it entirely on her, but she's too young, and it just doesn't feel right.
Yeah, I think weak link is maybe the right way to say. I don't think she's like. She's not bad. She's not. It's not a horrible thing. But Brandon Routh does such a good job of doing his own version of Superman, while also a little bit of imitation of Reeve. But Kate Bosworth is not really doing Margot Kidder at all.
Yeah.
And I think if you're going to set this as Spider-Man 3, if you're going to make this as Superman 3, it doesn't gel totally well.
Yeah. Honestly, I've always said this since seeing it the first time, but like, and this would be a different kind of age difference, but honestly, Parker Posey would have been a much better Lois Lane.
Oh, that'd be great.
I think she definitely has that Margot Kidder like spunk to her. So
yeah, definitely. Okay.
All right. Third act. Go ahead.
Third act. Okay. This movie in 2006 was the inception of my rule alarm.
What are the rules? What are the rules? What are the rules? What are the
And the reason why I say that is because this is where the critique that Superman fans hate, I think, comes into play. And I love this movie. I really do. It does amount to him lifting a big rock into the sky. And we've seen him lift a bunch of stuff already, so it's not super exciting. But, listeners, the rock is not just a rock. It is a giant piece of kryptonite protruding out while he does it. And also, he's been stabbed twice with kryptonite, and a wedge of it has been lodged into his ribs, like Jesus. You know, that's the whole idea they're going with in this at the end here. And Superman, I've come around to the Superman is too powerful thing. I get it, but in this case, I still can't quite get over the fact that his one weakness, his one that everybody knows, that there's a song made about it, you know, it's still no big deal. No big deal to Superman.
Oh, see, I hate this criticism, so I am going to argue with you. Finally, now we're getting somewhere. Now we finally have a disagreement.
All of our listeners leaned in just now.
Because this is the criticism that drives me crazy, especially when you just said, because like you just said the thing that I hate when people say, where they go, "Can't believe this movie ends with him like lifting a big rock of kryptonite like it's no big deal." That is not at all what happens. The reason I think that scene works is because there's a couple elements to it. It's not a storytelling problem to have someone confront their greatest weakness and try to overcome it, and that's what we see here. First of all, you said he's been stabbed and everything. Before he goes off and it goes back down to the continent, the kryptonite continent, and lifts it, he flies up over the clouds and gets recharged by the sun. He's purposely recharging himself because he knows what he's about to do. Yeah. Also, before he gets off the plane, that he's like, so Richard and Lois save him. He's on the plane. She takes the kryptonite out of him. He starts to recover. He gets up.
Not all of the kryptonite.
Not what I mean. She pulls most of it out, I think. But he says to her, what does he say before he leaves? He says, "Goodbye, Lois." And I think in that moment he is going off to die. He thinks for sure. He's like, what I'm about to do is going to kill me. Mm-hmm. So it's not like, so when people say he does this like no big deal, it's not like he just grabs a rock. He's like, oh, it turns out kryptonite doesn't do anything to me. He lifts it. We see him struggle. We see him like is having a hard time with it. He gets it to space, sets it off, and then he essentially, dies. This is like their version of Death of Superman. He falls to the earth, dead, or, in a coma, what do you want to put it? He's taken to the hospital. I love that sequence where the doctors can't figure out what to do with him because, needles won't go in him.
That was cool. Yeah.
They try to shock him, everything just breaks. So,
I like that the crowd, I like that the world is kind of coming to his aid, too. It reminded me of, Spider-Man 2 in that sense. I like that.
So that's why I hate that criticism, and I've never really understood it because people make it sound like it's, no big deal to him, but the whole thing is just no. He builds up, the fortitude, the intestinal fortitude to, do this thing that he knows is, going to be super difficult, that might kill him. He thinks it will kill him, and he just pulls it off. And that's storytelling. That's mythology. We have movies where people rush into fire, and what, fire typically tends to kill people, but sometimes in movies people will get past it somehow and overcome it. That's what a heroic story is. So I just don't agree with that criticism at all. I think that's just what makes him a hero. What makes Superman the greatest hero is the fact that he would say, you know what, that's made of the one thing that can kill me, but I'm still the only person that can do this, so I have to do it.
Yeah. Still doesn't kill him though. So,
I mean, it kills him as much as Doomsday killed him in Death of Superman. That's just this is a comic book thing, right? Death for these heroes means they're in a coma for a bit.
Yeah,
I do think it's funny. What they don't seem to realize at the hospital is because, they just don't have the background info on him. But they're trying to give him injections, they're trying to shock him when all they need to do is open the curtains and just let that sunlight in.
Totally. Yeah, don't get me wrong. I think this in this view, like I told you, this was my favorite viewing of the movie, and I definitely, quote unquote, got it more in this one, that he was yes, he was going off to die and he was sacrificing himself for the greater good. I totally get that, and I like it. I just think it's still a little, it's just too much kryptonite. I don't know, something about it is just too much. Don't, I don't know how you do it differently. I don't know.
Yeah, because I don't think he did it. I don't think
he gets stabbed so hard twice with it, and then there's still a shard in him at the end, and he's lifting the whole thing up, and it's the biggest fucking continent in the world compared, it's the biggest rock of kryptonite he's ever held, and it's sticking out, it's going right to his eyeballs basically, and I'm just I don't need it to be
What if like right in the middle of that scene they cut to like just randomly cut to some scientist for no reason who's like looking at like a chalkboard with a bunch of equations, and they go like, it turns out when the kryptonite mixes with the earth material, it dilutes itself by like 60%. Like man, that could have solved everything for you.
Or he recharges while he's lifting it. He leaves the helicopter. He goes to. I hate rewriting movies, but Trev loves it. I hate it, but he leaves the helicopter, does his thing that he needs to do.
It's a plane, but okay.
What'd I say?
Helicopter.
Oh, okay. All right.
Maybe that's what you guys call planes in Canada.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, helicopters don't exist up here. But he's lifting the whole continent up, and then the cloud breaks, and the sun comes in, hits him. It's like divine intervention, to keep with the Jesus metaphor that Singer's going for at the end. I'm not saying it would be better. I'm just saying, Yeah, I don't know.
I think it's like you said, it's hard to say how to do it better because
exactly.
I don't think it like devalues kryptonite to the point that it couldn't be a threat for him anymore in future movies. But like,
and what I've learned from my friend who loves Smallville, he even said, he goes, "There's so many kryptonite inconsistencies even in that show."
Yeah, that's the thing. Is like they've never made clear exactly what does that mean that kryptonite is. Well, his kryptonite. It's weird to say that because it's like I'm using the analogy on the actual thing. But like, in some like, does he need to be? What if it's just like a small piece? Like, how close does he have to get to it? They've never set rules on this, anyways. So,
yeah, no, I get it. I get it. I just wanted a little bit of argument. We've been too nice to each other today.
And Chris, before we like wrap up talking about the movie, I just wanted to also throw out one last quick little neat little Easter egg I think they threw in. Is that there's a couple cameos from other people that are notable in like Superman history. There's a scene where Jimmy Olsen and Clark go to a bar, and also we haven't really talked about Sam Huntington, but I do really think Jimmy and Clark's relationship is very funny in this, and I like the energy they have together. But the bartender in that scene is also Jack Larson, who played Jimmy Olsen in the '50s television Superman series.
Cool.
And then the beginning of the movie, the old woman that Lex Luthor like swindles and takes all her money to finance his plan. That's played by Noel Neill, who is the original Lois Lane. So I like that they threw both of them in there. Yeah,
cool. So Trev, what happens at the end, like of this saga of the Superman Returns? Right, it comes out, it does okay by budget standards, and people do like it. They did announce a sequel 4 months before it comes out, and because it underwhelms, it kind of gets shelved a little bit. The writers go off to do other things. Bryan Singer, what does he want to go? He wants to do Logan's Run. I know that he was attached to that for a while. It was like a dream
project of his for a long time, yeah.
And
then, you know what? That's not all Bryan Singer wants to do.
Oh, he wants to see Logan's Run. I don't know what that means. I don't know what it means. Cut that. But they do say, the writers do say, with the sequel plans, they were looking to make it more action-packed, bring in Brainiac and Bizarro as villains, and include that big, Kryptonian landmass that's in space now, serving as a plot device. The weird thing I found out about all this was that Brandon Routh was really left out of the conversation of all this, hey?
Yeah.
Like, it sounds like obviously he signed on for a multi-film deal, but he was really not aware of any plans. Like, he's quoted as saying, like, I had no idea, I heard rumors, like, it was never to me directly. Yeah. And also, like things were always, this is going to sound shocking, Trev, but things were always changing at Warner Brothers. New guards were coming in, old guards were out. So...
I mean, I think we've talked about other movies like this, but this is like one of the ultimate cases of like, I'd say this and the fourth Star Trek movie of the J.J. Abrams universe are the two movies I can think of where I've followed him as closely as this. Like, so like that, the Star Trek one is still ongoing. There was like a news story today saying that like now that the Writers Guild strike is done, Paramount might be fast tracking Star Trek 4 again just to get something going. I'm like, okay, yeah, whatever. I'll believe it when I see it. But this is another one where I remember, because I liked Superman Returns and I found myself in a role of like being a defender of it pretty quickly. I was always like heavily tracking and going back and forth in my own head over the years about whether or not I thought they were going to make the sequel. Like there was definitely times where I was like, no, it's going to happen. And then there's other times where I was like, I don't know, it's probably not. But I remember through all that getting that sense because I saw anytime Brandon Routh was asked, his answer was just always like, yeah, I want to, but I don't know. And you could just tell they weren't talking to him at all. And that was when that started to really crystallize for me, no pun intended. That's when I knew it was dead. Where I was like, oh, they're not talking to him. Like they're not going to bring him back. This is done.
No.
Yeah.
Well, they decide in 2009 to just reboot the franchise. And at that point, Bryan Singer completely drops out and goes to direct Jack the Giant Slayer.
Good move.
Yeah. Luckily enough, Brandon Routh did get to reprise this role in some way, shape, or form. So as Trev has brought up in this episode and a few, he would, I'm not going to speak, well, I guess I'm speaking for you now, but you were a fan of or at least followed the Arrowverse on CW. And they did in 2019, Crisis on Infinite Earths. And he came back as Clark Kent.
And before that, so he had already been a part of the Arrowverse. They brought him onto the Flash and Arrow as the Atom in the Arrowverse. And at first, they just had like one little cute little joke so it was that was just kind of cool enough, where it's like, oh, Brandon Routh kind of got really shafted on the Superman thing, but now he gets to play a different DC hero, a really fun, again, there was a character that spoke to his strengths, like a really energetic, optimistic, funny guy, right, a superhero. And there was a sequence where he meets Supergirl, and they just have him like look at Supergirl and go, you kind of look like my cousin. And so it was like, I get it, because he was Superman, Yeah. But then, then they did their big Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover where they did, their version of a multiverse story. And Tom Welling showed up in that as the Smallville Superman. And then, sure enough, they had Brandon Routh reprise the Superman role. And it's interesting because it's hard. I don't know if you've watched those scenes at all, Chris. It's really great to see Brandon Routh as Superman again. Obviously, completely different budget level and quality level than this movie. But he's wearing the Kingdom Come Superman suit, which has the black S. And they very specifically say, and he's now Clark Kent, editor-in-chief of the Daily Planet. He's got a little bit of gray in his hair. And, the reason the S is black is he's in mourning because it's revealed that the Joker actually set off a gas bomb in the Daily Planet, which killed Perry White, Jimmy Olsen, and Lois.
Oh,
and
wow.
Lois was had been his wife at this point. So it's strange I don't know if they're saying or they want you to think that that's the same continuity, because that's kind of weird to say we decided that the Donnerverse ends in the death of all these characters, or if he's just supposed to be playing another version of Superman. Ultimately, I guess it doesn't matter. He got to play Superman again. Totally. And you can be cynical and say those episodes look cheap and they're goofy, and they are. But it's hard not to watch those scenes and just feel good for him, because it must have been great for him to get to, because he definitely wanted to go back, and so for him to get that chance finally, and when he announced it at Comic-Con and he pulled off his shirt to reveal the Superman shirt and everyone went nuts, it just seemed like such a victory lap for him, to finally come back.
It's amazing to be a part of the Crisis on Infinite Earth storyline.
I'm excited to do something so epic with all these guys up here.
This is obviously a very special one for me, being back in blue.
I made a promise to keep fighting, no matter what.
I think what makes Superman such a great hero at his core is that he shows us the best that is within us.
Told you you'd catch me.
Clark just sees himself as someone who does what he can with the abilities that he has. Back from here?
You're also probably passing out.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Even if Superman didn't have all of his abilities, he saw all the great characteristics that make him caring about humanity. I think he is a shining example of what we can hope to be as human beings. That's certainly what I try to learn from him in his example every day.
Hope is the light that lifts us out of darkness.
Does he get some action scenes? Does he get
He
to
does.
fly
He gets
around?
because he gets turned bad for a second by Lex Luthor, who has a mystical book in that crossover.
Okay.
So he actually fights the Tyler Hoechlin Superman, which is the Superman of Superman and Lois. So they have a fight scene, and then he gets a little bit more action at the end. And I think one of the episodes, or even the whole crossover, he ends with every Superman movie, including this one that we did today, ends with that shot of Superman flying in space, looking over the Earth. I think they do that with him too at the end to give him his final moment, as Superman. So. Yeah.
Love that.
Yep.
He deserved more movies, honestly. I think I walked away from this one just bummed out, I would have gladly watched more Brandon Routh adventures.
And I do think, again, look, it's not the worst thing in the world that if the allegations are true that a bad person didn't get more work. But I will say to the people who the critiques of this movie, some of which we've said are valid, you know, and I said I think Bryan Singer maybe shouldn't have been as hard on himself about those critiques.
Yeah.
But I do think with a sequel, and like there was every indication, every interview he gave, I think he would have listened to those criticisms, and I think him and his co-writers would have delivered a much more action-packed sequel, you know, with like, you know, more larger-than-life villains. I think everything that people were like upset they didn't get in Superman Returns, they would have got in the sequel. So I think it's really too bad Warner Brothers wasn't willing to take that risk. It's too bad that they did take the risk on Batman Begins, but not this one.
It just sucks that they just overcorrected so hard with Man of Steel. You know, like it's such what a stark contrast watching this movie after all this time. You know, after everything we've seen that's happened in the DC universe and that interpretation of the character and even Henry Cavill's performance in that, right? It's just kind of, it's fucking black and white, you know? It's such a different thing. And I've argued with people that love Man of Steel and just being like, hey, it's not a Superman movie. Like, you like it because it's fun and wham bam and, you know, action heavy, but it's not a Superman movie. So, like you said, the Snyder bros hate us, but I don't really care. So they barely exist. It's all bots. So who cares?
So I think it's safe to say this is like from both of us an easy recommend, right? The first of the DCPU that we can rave with like kind of no reservations. Like I like Supergirl ironically, but that's not the case here. This is a good comic book movie that deserves to be revisited, even by people who might have been a little iffy about it in the past. Like I said, I do think this is one where check it out now, because this feels like such a nice antidote to what the recent superhero movies have become. That's what I really think time has helped this one.
Big time. Yep. And going forward in the DCPU, we're jumping another decade. I love how this worked out really well with our
Thank you, Warner Brothers, for every decade shitting the bed.
But we are looking at Green Lantern from 2011, then going into Black Adam of 2022, and then capping off the DCPU with The Flash from 2023.
That's right. We're calling our shot now.
Pretty confident, so it's fine. But follow along at F2F Pod. That's at F2, the number 2F Pod on all the socials. Like us there, like us everywhere. Rate, review, whatever you do. A star rating would be great. And just join the tribe and hit that subscribe and keep on with this with the DCPU. It's been an interesting one so far. The revisit on this one was awesome for me. Unsure about the next one and the next one and the next one. But you'll be with us, I guess.
Yeah. Look, you knew what we were signing up for when we got into this, so.
Come on, let me hear you say it just once. Come on.
You're insane.
No! No, the other thing. Come on, I know it's just dangling out the tip of your tongue. Let me hear it just once, please.
Superman will never...
Wrong!